So I am delighted to welcome Christina Shewell to the podcast. We're going to have an exciting discussion about voice work. Christina's book, Art and Science in Changing Voices, is available and reflects a long career that Christina is going to share with us about this fascinating interplay between voice, health, and communication. So, Christina, welcome. And I always like to start with this question about why integrative medicine might matter to you.
Well, I guess it's involved with my history in that I started as a speech therapist, working with adults who'd lost their speech after stroke or other neurological problems. And that was my specialism for 12 years. And I ended up, I did a master's in linguistics after my training because it had always seemed the worst thing possible not to be able to speak, not to share your thoughts, not to link to others through this benevolent business or speech. And I worked in that field, became head of department in Cambridge. And then, for various reasons, when I was 33, changed my life. And I went back into my first love, which was the arts. I'd always loved poetry and theatre and done a lot. And I trained as a theatre voice teacher at the Central School of Speech and Drama. And since then, I've married the two. So there's been for me a genuine integration of the art approach and the science approach. And my favorite quote about that integration is from Mario Petrucci, who's a poet and a physicist. And he said, and art are kissing cousins, each in their own way. They pay the world full attention. And I love that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, since then, I've had a Harley Street private practice for 12 years, 1 day a week, with the kind of top professional voice users and, thank goodness, ordinary people as well. And worked in the NHS. I was senior lecturer at University College in the Department of Communication Science. And at the same time, I was teaching as a staff member at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, training actors. I did a short stint at the RSC teaching dialect to the Wizard of Oz cast. So I like this word integration. It's just by chance the way I've lived. And I've always been interested in the meeting point of two words that are opposites. And when I first heard about NCIM through you, it it was just so obvious that it made sense that Western medicine can't solve everything, and nor can what's now called complementary therapy, that we need that marriage. And then over the last probably 5 years, I've always been interested in the power of voice and words to heal, but I've made more of a study of that and explored it more and set up these workshops, the first of which was run through NCIM, called Body, Voice and Wellbeing. So that's rather
Beautiful.
a long answer, but that's
No, it's
how.
beautiful. And this marrying of art and science comes through a lot of whole system approaches that, and I guess relates also to this kind of left brain, this logical, sequential part of our brains, and then this right brain, which is complex, how we make sense of things, how we recognize patterns. And there's research emerging, that when we can activate both sides of the brain, we're healthier, happier, we live longer. So it seems to me that medicine should do that as well, bringing those elements through. And also, I guess, the unknown, which the arts bring, the
Oh,
idea
goodness.
that sometimes we'll need something that takes us beyond facts into something deeper.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You used the word healing, and I wanted to ask you about how you saw that healing playing out with art and science and voice.
Well, there's people take for granted voice. We're born, we breathe, we voice. And then babies communicate the only way they can through the sound of their cry. And then that becomes more and more differentiated. And language, we forget really, is socialized voice. And when you're two, almost any noise you make is, if you're loved, is delights your caregivers. But then we become older and we are told to be quiet, not to say certain things, not to make such a noise. And other than singing in choirs, most people then control their voice through words. I mean, choir singing is enormously popular. There was a big choral census in 2017, and it was found that there are 40,000 choirs or more in this country, and 2.14 million people sing in them.
Wow.
So we know singing is a release and it makes people feel better. But in our ordinary lives, we don't have that outlet, those who don't want to sing. And there's some quite esoteric research done by Fabienne Manon, who actually took all sorts of cells and put them into, what are those jars called? This.
Petri dishes.
Yes, thank you, petri dishes. And he photographed the different ways that voice affected these cells. Now, obviously, his research, has not been replicated. I don't say obviously, maybe someone's tried, but we know that somebody's voice can make us feel good or bad, and that our voices can make us feel good or bad. So singing is an example, but sometimes just shouting for the joy of it on a windy beach can be a huge release. And I'm
Mm.
interested in the way that we can use voice to change how we feel, and also the way that different voices affect listeners. So there's a mystery here, of course there is, and there are people working in this field. There's a very nice book by James D'Angelo called Healing with the Voice, which has more of what one might call the magic of voice. It's not hugely science-based, but it's none the worse for that. And he's got a lot of exercises for exploring the way that voice can affect our psyche and our bodies.
Mm. And also, we can see in later life that those who attend a choir just seem again to be healthier. And whether
Mm,
it's the breath, whether it's community, and again, this magic of sounding together. Like
mm,
you
mm,
and I love the murmuration of the swallows, where we're really looking into the sky and seeing an example of oneness.
mm.
I was there on a very busy day at local to Bristol is Somerset and a place called the Ham Wall. As the starlings, I said swallows, the starlings rose into the air. Everyone was
Yeah.
ooh, and this, I guess, is the sounding of awe, isn't it?
Yes.
That sounding together
Absolutely.
is an
And it
amazing.
is that release of openness. You open the throat, you
Mhm.
open the breath.
Yes.
And isn't it interesting, slight digression, but it links to my work. The word murmuration, which is
Mm,
such a beautiful word, but
mm,
they don't actually make sound. They're not singing and making sound. If you're
mm,
lucky enough that they fly low, then there is a sort of beating of wings. But I'm
mm.
fascinated that it was called murmuration.
You're quite right. And there's even a choir in Bristol called Murmuration. But you're only just making me realize that part of the magic of that image of oneness in the sky as it builds and builds and builds is that it is apart from the wings, it's silent. So
Yes.
it's movement rather than sound.
Mm.
Very interesting. Yeah.
And sound is movement. I mean, I love running practical workshops in voice. And there's an exercise where you get two lines of people lining up quite close facing each other. And they all just intone a note at a strong R. And I call it the corridor of sound. And one by one, it's a bit like Strip the Willow, one by one, people walk through this corridor of sound. And as you walk, you not just hear, but you feel almost the vibrations hitting you because they are physical.
Mm.
And we forget that.
Yes, and also sound baths, where we would use
Yeah.
bowls or, again, that idea of the resonant frequency into interacting with our bodies, which are also energetic, vibrational, and we know every atom is vibrating, don't we? Every cell must
Yeah.
therefore be vibrating. So that yeah, the science of sound as healer is evolving, I think, all the time.
It is. And, as I say, we take it for granted. And if we come back stressed from a difficult day for whatever reason, I've worked a lot with teachers, and often, I'd say, "So when you come back tired, what do you do?" And they'd say, "Well, I go and put the kettle on," nearly always. And then they would sort of start doing stuff, or they'd stand there and maybe they'd jiggle, or they'd go over something. Actually, and I've worked with MPs and politicians, said the same to them. Do you know what? If you come in, you put the kettle on, if you lie on the floor and you stretch and you groan and you release some sound and you maybe even release some words that just come bubbling out of your body, your energy will change and
Mm,
it will release. We block. We live in this extremely stressful, worrying world, and our bodies are often tense.
mm,
And if we can release our bodies in a stretch, or we lie on the floor, or we do something ridiculous, and we make sound, we are changing the energy within our body. But
mm.
most people don't do that because they're inhibited. And sometimes when I'm running a workshop, I'll say, and I'm getting people to do all sorts of amazing sounds, and I'll say, "So if you feel self-conscious, just get over it because nobody's interested in you except you." And yet people can feel self-conscious even when they're on their own because we have this inhibition about releasing sound
Yeah.
unless it's a inappropriate place.
And I know that even from our team within NCIM, we start our Monday mornings team with sometimes we'll do a meditation that involves sounding and I sing, as you know, jazz, and I'm in a choir, and so I'm quite comfortable to sound. And sometimes I might sound a bit louder so that others will feel I'm kind of covering for them with their discomfort. But I notice that sometimes in the break, because I can't, I have to breathe at some point, that everyone will quieten down. So I think that that is a true suppression, of sound, of self.
Mm,
I'm also, sometimes I'll switch on live at the Apollo, thousands of people sitting in that theater. They're just ready to laugh, even if the guy or the woman are not that funny. That's a permissioning, isn't it? And again,
absolutely.
I wondered as a therapist how you would, this ha ha ha, like how would you interpret that laughter? Because it's a big sound, isn't it?
It is, and it's an open sound. And
Mm,
Professor Sophie Scott, who's at my old university of University College, London, she's become quite a media person.
mm.
And she is an absolute, she heads up one of the psychology departments. And forgive me, Sophie, I've forgotten the name, but she's done a huge amount of work on laughter. And she's actually become a stand up comedian,
Really?
very part time. I remember hearing her on the radio not that long ago, where she was talking about the infectiousness of laughter, and
Mm,
that actually, even when it's pretend laughter, it can still be infectious, but that
mm,
actually we laugh more when we're with other people.
mm,
It's interesting because in terms of the laryngeal structure, both sobbing and laughing open the throat, interestingly. I
mm.
don't mean the kind of retching, terrible grief sobbing, but if I'm working with a client or a group, we'll do operatic sobbing. Oh, 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 woe is me type stuff. And that is very similar. You see, it
Mm.
makes you laugh. And when we do it in a workshop, actually everybody laughs. And of course, you're then opening up even more.
And also how lucky, I was thinking, how actors and singers, particularly in opera, which is always so big and bold, how there's a lot of release there when you are an actor, because you can put yourself through the range of experience, can't you?
Absolutely. And I mean, one Simon Callow wrote about this years ago. He said, if I'm playing Hitler, I don't become Hitler. It doesn't affect me in that way, but it's exploring a tiny part of me that has anger or evil or. And one of the things I say is there are two everyday miracles. Well, there are many miracles, but when we are talking, like you and I are talking now, everybody converses unless they have the tragedy of a speech limitation. As we're talking, we don't know what we're going to say. we start to talk, and this sound is shaped by this amazing musical instrument. And the second miracle, which links to that, is the power of actors. Because what an actor does is they make you feel that just as for you and me, our voices and speech and words is coming from our heart and our mind and our body and our spirit, if you believe in spirit, an actor who does 8 shows a week has to make you believe that they've never said this before. And it's extraordinary, which is why actors do so much body work and breath work and voice work.
And you shifted, didn't you, from the health service into supporting actors? Is that right? You know, that was a really interesting transition point in your life.
It was a major change. I mean, as so often, and I'm sure other people know this, we make a professional change because of our personal
Mm.
circumstances. And
Mm.
I'd had a crisis year, really. All sorts of things had happened. And something in me needed the healing of the arts. I mean,
Mm.
I loved my job. I loved working with people who had lost their speech. I mean, it was extremely sad, but I was challenged by it. I'd set up a volunteer scheme. I had this very solid job. I worked in a wonderful team with the neurology team, but something in me needed to make that change. And I had been very much on the medical side. I mean, the original speech therapy training, we got to second MB level, and some people actually left and then went on and trained as doctors. But I'd always known that communication has this other side, and of course, relationships. So my own therapy and my training in counseling skills has been hugely important in listening to people, because we talk about voice work, but part of that, if you're a practitioner, whether you're a singing teacher, speech therapist specialized in voice disorders, or an acting public speaker teacher, is listening.
Mm.
So I did go into working with actors, but I was also working with, the nervous young person who was coming up for a bar mitzvah, or somebody wanted to work on a wedding speech, and certainly in the business world, politicians, people who were speaking out rather than speaking close,
Mm.
and for the challenges for them in being seen and heard and allowing their true voice to come out in that context. And I love that work. I still work as a coach for RADA business with, quote, ordinary people, not actors. And I love it.
And tell me just a bit more about speaking out. How would you support someone who is getting very maybe anxious about speaking out? We talk about projecting ourselves, don't we? Would the
We do. I mean, voice teachers don't use that word. I still like it because it
Yeah.
means to stretch out.
Yes.
How would I do that? Well, I mean, obviously, it depends completely on the personality. I always say to my students, when we meet a new client, there are two questions. Who have we here? And then what have we here? And the what is what they're doing with their voice. But if we talk about for a moment this what's happening, I'm sort of known in this funny little profession of mine because I've developed something called the voice skills approach, which is a way of naming these mysterious aspects of voice that occur. So the first thing I'd look at is the body. That underpins everything. What's the body doing?
Mm.
So many people are talking and they're, like this, or they have a very tight jaw and it inhibits the voice. So the body, the breath, then what's this tube, which in medical terms they call the vocal tract, which runs from the level of the vocal cords to the front of the mouth? What's it doing? And we can inhibit, so we can block and constrict anywhere along that. So, some people sound like this, some people sound like this, some people sound like this. And it's all about tightening.
Mm.
So listen to that, listen to what's happening in the vocal folds, because some people have a lot of breathiness in their voice, and some people have a lot of tension. And so I'm listening and trying to work out how are you manifesting in your voice? And
Mm.
then you've used the word resonance. We, of course, listen to resonance. We listen to the pitch. Is there a variety? So many people have said over the years to me, I know I'm boring. I don't have enough variety in my pitch, but there's lots of other variety that we can have as well. And then we listen to the volume, and then we listen to the speed, whether they use pauses, and of course the pronunciation. Now, all of those are going on in this extraordinary musical instrument called voice,
Mm.
and they're all interacting. And our job as a voice practitioner is, what isn't working as this person would like? So, just a personal story. When I started training as a voice teacher at 33, I moved from, in those days, walking around the hospital in a white coat, having a status, to suddenly having black leggings and a black t-shirt, rolling around on the floor, making noises. And I was very nervous. And my voice teacher said to me, "For goodness sake, stop doing that Miss Mouse voice." Because voice teachers can be tough. I'm not very tough. And I said, I don't know what you mean by my Miss Mouse voice, but this is how I was speaking all the time. And you can hear the difference. It's still me, but actually, this is what I call a disembodied voice. So if I had somebody who was speaking like this, my job is to say, to notice and think, this doesn't sound like it's coming from the true them.
Mm.
Then to work out technically with those 8 aspects, what is it and how can I help them change it without threatening, without saying, "Oh, for goodness sake, stop doing that." And it's detective work, really.
Beautiful.
And
Yeah.
yeah, just to say, it's finding what the person wants, because we also work with the transgender clients,
Mm.
and that's a very important area now.
Mm.
Much more, quite rightly, support and publicity for that area. And speech therapists have interestingly always worked with that group, and it's been paid for by the NHS.
Mm. Mm. As people find themselves. And
Yeah.
I was thinking about how if medicine, was couched in who have we here rather than what diagnosis have we here, just who have we here. And I would say that as an integrative clinician, that is very much how I welcome someone into a Zoom room or a clinic room is who have I here?
Yeah.
And I think it's a beautiful way to start any therapeutic interchange.
Yeah.
And I refer to it like a chocolate box, like how exciting, who have we here? Because they
Yes.
will be completely different to anyone else I've seen before.
That's lovely. And you're helping unwrap
Yes,
the
exactly.
covering.
Yeah.
Yeah. To
Whereas
find the
if I
secrets.
get someone in with a diagnosis, say, oh, here's another person with breast cancer, then I'm not going to get that, sense of the person primarily as my first point of connection.
Absolutely. And I teach, when I work with clinicians, I say a good way to start is, okay, tell me the story. You
Mm.
tell me the story of your voice if it's they're working with
Mm.
voice.
Yeah.
I mean, what you're saying about, in your work, and there's a lovely study which I quote when I've taught medical students, um, by Ambardi et al. In, I think it was 2004, where they took tiny extracts from, this is done in America, from surgeons who'd been sued for malpractice, tiny extracts of interviews that the surgeons did with patients and from those who hadn't. And they then played them to listeners. They were extremely short extracts, just the voices. And they asked listeners to rate them on a scale of kind of, approachable, trustworthy, supportive. And there was an extraordinary accuracy in the correlation between the negative voice features that listeners heard with the surgeons who'd been sued for malpractice.
Amazing. It's almost like we're primed for safety. So we're going to kind of be detecting, these very fine,
Subtle.
subtle,
Absolutely.
subtle.
But you know that, Elizabeth, you or anyone listening to this podcast, we ring a friend and they say hello, and you say, "What? Are you all right?" You know,
Yes.
2 syllables, and
Yes.
in that is all this feeling.
Yeah. Incredible. Um, and I'm going to a funeral later today, and again, we talked about this, didn't we? That in other cultures there might be keening or an expression, shared expression through voice of grief, but in Britain, we've really learnt to silence ourselves. I don't know whether you'd say a little bit about that kind of, experience of how you do you what I suppose my question is, do you ever see grief trapped in the voice and how you might release it?
Absolutely. I'm at such a deep question. When in my work as a speech therapist with voice disorders, stress often affects the voice. I've said that. But sometimes there is a deep unconscious thing going on. Freud would call it a hysterical aphonia or a conversion aphonia. Well, not Freud, but Freud's followers. And we would get sometimes clients who have completely lost their voice and yet they can cough. And that's always the ENT surgeon's check. Can you cough? And these patients can cough with, but they're whispering. Or sometimes, this is an accurate imitation, I've had a number of people who arrive like this. The voice is like this. And it's very difficult to listen to. And
Mm,
that person has no idea of what's happened.
mm,
And I mean, anatomically, the larynx is shot right up, everything's constricted. Or in the aphonia, the lack of voice, there's the vocal folds have forgotten how to close, so it's whisper. And often, but not always, there is an underlying psyche cause, which causes this psychosomatic problem. And it's often grief or conflict.
mm,
I had a woman called Ruth not that long ago, and I often play her to students, and she came with virtually no voice at all. She had been very stressed because she'd been responsible for looking after basically too many people. And over that year, she'd had no voice for a year, and she'd had all sorts of medical investigations. She had struggled to breathe because she got panicked. And she finally went to see an ENT surgeon who recognized the feeling was blocking the sound, and the feeling was linked to grief because her father had died as well. And she came to me, and within that first session, we refound the full voice
mm.
because it was behavioral but deeply rooted in sadness. And she then was able to speak about what that sadness was.
Incredible.
But I think, when you go to this funeral memorial this afternoon, of course there will be tears, but we're not a culture who wail and howl in grief. I think you may have seen Hamnet
Yeah.
recently, the film, and there was a moment when Jessie Buckley, as Agnes, realizes her son is dead, and she just yells. I mean, she screams.
Mm,
And that is a release, but we don't do it in this culture at our funerals and memorials.
yeah. That releasing can also, need to be re-released and re-released and re-released. It is about having enough elements in our community that release through laughter, release through song,
Yeah.
release through movement, or through one-to-one therapy. But, I guess the focus of this podcast is how, voice work can be deeply therapeutic across a
Yeah.
whole range of life experience and conditions, that might be creating distress for us.
Deeply. And we're talking about therapeutic from mending the damaged voice. I
Yeah.
mean, there's also the loss of voice. The most extreme, obviously, medically, is when you have your larynx removed,
Mm,
and how people can learn to use a different sphincter, which is at the base of the esophagus, to vibrate.
mm,
But then we've got the whole spectrum from mending to the more emotional side.
mm,
And what I'd say about this notion of release is that if we do work like that, and I've done some very deep work with something called the Roy Hart Theatre, which is based in Malherbe in the Cevennes in France, and their focus for many, many years has been working with the voice as a theatrical focus, and also something called the Body Soul Rhythms, which was developed by Marion Woodman, Canadian Jungian analyst, and she was one of the first Jungians to say we have to work with body and we have to work with the voice. So she ran these extraordinary courses for therapists on where there was a voice teacher. I led one of them, and a movement teacher. So people would move, they'd sing, they'd wail, they'd howl in a very safe context. And what I would say is that, and this is really an important thing, is that sound release is frightening and it needs to be very well contained if you're in a group. And it needs to be led by someone who's very responsible, maybe even with other people to hold. Because when we start to even breathe, sometimes every voice teacher's done breath work with a group of young acting students, and one or two people start to cry because breath work releases emotion. When you get sound, it's even more. So it's not always that sound release is a good thing because it can be very frightening for people who are on the edge in whatever way. It needs to be very, very carefully looked after.
Yes, and even in my labors, I would get to a point where I started to bellow, and I, a really loud sound. And I remember
Yeah,
one of the midwives shutting shutting the door,
yes,
because of how those on the other side might think that it was all going horribly wrong, but actually I was laboring really well. And I feel the suppression of sounding in labor. I had maybe the confidence to know I had to stay with my body and my voice, but
yes,
others wouldn't. And that's a
yes.
shame, I think.
Absolutely. I'm smiling because when I was about 20, I had a medical student boyfriend and he was doing his obstetrics bit. And he came back and he said, "It's just awful. These women, they scream and they don't need to scream." And of course, I didn't know. He was very irritated by these yelling women. And of course, it's if there's one place you need to open up. I mean, I'm jumping around, but I must tell you something, which is there is a French ENT specialist called Jean-Abit Boll, and he says that the histological analysis of cells, I'll probably get this slightly wrong, cells in the epithelium of the vocal folds is very similar to that of the cervix.
Mm.
And if you see a film of the laryngeal examination, which is so wonderfully done now with a camera through the nose, the first time I showed my husband it, he said, "Which part of the body am I looking at?" So I suppose I'm in the rambly way, I'm saying, yes, of course, women, open your throat, because then at the same time you may be opening everything else.
And also it was not conscious that this
No,
I haven't
no.
made that sound since. It was a deep, deep, I
Oh,
would say a bellowing, but now I'm realizing that my cervix was stretching and opening up,
oh,
and
oh.
that's what you need, isn't it? So it's almost like the two parts of the body were interconnecting to assist.
Absolutely. And it's what you were making what some writers call the primal sound, the absolutely raw sound, which of
Mm,
course we've all had as babies. Going back to that original point I was making.
mm, yes.
And I just would, so that, I suppose really what I'm saying is also, I want to say is that within spoken words, there is voice, but
Mm,
words also have an incredible power. I gave a talk recently at a conference that I called Sticks and Stones, Words and Voice. And you know the old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Words, of course, hurt
mm,
and we can wound people deeply. But we also know that there's a kind of secret power of words to affect the body. So it's not just a question of saying something horrible hurts their feelings. It's
mm,
that some words give you a lovely feeling and some words don't.
mm.
So there is a power within consonants and vowels. And I remember Seamus Heaney, the wonderful Irish poet, said when he discovered poetry, he said, "All at once I discovered the power of world made word, world made word."
Mm.
And words are extraordinary things. They are like a TARDIS. They hold so much more than we think they do.
Yeah, they do.
And the power of poetry distills that. I think we see it in that.
Yes, and some of the phrases that, that I might reflect on that describe human experience. It's a series of words, but the sounding of it as well, it
Yeah.
is describing human experience. So it is extraordinary. And we won't use any swear words on the podcast, but those swear words often are quite hard and short, aren't they?
Mm. They are.
And so they might allow kind of anger just to emerge in little pockets.
Yes. And swearing on your own is a really good thing.
Mm.
And those swear words are extremely powerful. And in fact, with aphasia or dysphasia, aphasia, the loss of language or the impairment of language through brain damage, you sometimes find that some people can only swear. It's
Mm.
like it's a lower level of the brain somehow stores these words.
Mm.
There's just coming to your area of course, which is integrative medicine and healing. There's some absolutely, it's not just spoken. Well, there's a wonderful line which people will know in Macbeth: give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak whispers the o'er-fraught heart and bids it break. That actually speaking our pain helps us. And Shakespeare writes about that so beautifully. But there's fascinating work which was started by a man called James Pennebaker in the 70s, looking at the power of expressive writing to heal. And
Mm.
there's a lovely study which I really recommend reading. I'm just going to get the reference right. So it was by Robinson et al. In 2017 in Brain Behavior and Immunity. And what they did was they got volunteers who they paid to have 4 millimeter puncture wounds put into their arms. Volunteers will do almost anything if you pay them. And so, and they split them into groups, and there were actually four groups, but there were two that are most relevant. One group, before they had the puncture wound, were asked to write about something emotional. Quite a lot, what matters to you, what's affected you. So they wrote, and then they had the puncture wound. The other group wrote about neutral things. So, how do you get from your house to the supermarket? And then these were very carefully measured, using microscopic measurement in terms of the rate of healing. And after 10 days, and I'm just going to get these right, group A, who'd written about emotional things, 52% of them had complete healing,
Mm.
whereas group B had only 15% were healed. Now, this is extraordinary because it is about this power of words to have a physiological effect on healing.
Mm.
So, there's a lot more. It's mysterious and you can carry it too far, but it is a most interesting area for research, the power of words to affect our bodies, our immune system, and help healing.
It is fascinating. And there was another research done in rheumatoid arthritis to show that those who were expressing themselves through writing, that was part of the study, randomized to no writing or writing, they had lower levels of inflammation.
Well,
And when we're teaching on the diploma, like models of holistic consulting, we look at kind of subcellular, cellular, organ, individual, family, community. In other words, we look at levels of complexity. So it's so interesting that you'd see emotional release on one level, leading to enhanced function at the immune system. And it just
beautiful.
tells you that we are a super connected, complex system, that if we understand the mind body connection and how emotion, unwanted thinking impacts on our bodies, we can therefore say, let's do more voice work, more artwork, more
Yeah,
movement, more dance. Like, we're sitting in the arts in healthcare, aren't we, with our conversation? And people will say, oh, that's a luxury, we don't need to fund that. But that study suggests, yes, you do, because people will heal quicker if you are supporting them.
absolutely. You put that beautifully. Thank you.
And we are just coming up to the end of, yeah, a beautiful conversation. And I'm really grateful for all your incredible experience and expertise, but ability to communicate. For our listeners, Christina and I are part of a poetry group. And what is very beautiful is to listen to Christina recite a poem. Just hearing that bit of Shakespeare, I wanted you to go on because the power of words, but also the music of poetry and drama, that's what can uplift us, is connected. I just wondered if you wanted to say a few final words before we finish.
I'd like to say 129 final words. It's a huge and just endlessly fascinating area. I mean, we look at the American president's use of language, and
Mm.
how powerful it is, whatever we think of him. We look at the way that we make peace. Words are what connect us, and yet they are deeply mysterious. And I think all the best things we ever know, there's a mystery. And sometimes when I'm teaching, I talk about the lovely thing about voice, and maybe it's the same with medicine, that is that at one end of the spectrum, it's sort of muscular, mechanical. At the other, it's mysterious and mystical and musical. And the joy for me of working in communication skills, voice and words, is that first of all, working with human beings, what I call PHBs to my students. I say, never forget you're working with a PHB, a precious human being.
Mm.
But also, we've got this spectrum, and that's the complexity of the human being, and the complexity of voice, and the complexity of life.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, let's end it there, but deep thanks. Yeah,
It's been
and
a pleasure.
we'll put lots of information in our show notes so that people can connect to your book, to your work, and some of those research articles as well. So thank you, Christina.
Thank you.